Welcome to Return to Freedom's first webinar of the year. My name is Cory. I'm the Advocacy and Communications Coordinator for RTF. Thank you all for supporting wild horses and burros. It's my great pleasure to introduce Chris Heyde. Chris has been a lobbyist since 1997. He's been with us since 2017, and he has worked on the horse slaughter and wild horse issue for more years than he probably would like to admit. So we're going to kind of break this up into a couple of components tonight. We're going to talk first about the wild horses specifically, and then second about horse slaughter. And the reason that we do that is because Congress treats those issues separately, even though there's an overlap between the two. They go through the appropriations process, the budget process, they go through them separately. And so we're going to do the same, but there's a lot of overlap. And we'll get to that. For starters, we wanted to give you a little bit of context and to kind of tell you where things were with the last Congress. Very difficult time. This administration, the BLM, and some members of Congress have been more aggressive on the wild horse issue than at any time in the recent past, and Chris can touch on that a little bit. To start out, in 2017, the President's fiscal year 2018 budget proposal came out, included sales without limitation, which is sort of synonymous in the advocacy world for sales to slaughter. That means no prohibition against slaughter. And it also included removing language restricting BLM's ability to use all of the management tools authorized in the Wild Free Roving Horses and Burros Act. It's synonymous for us as another way of saying opening the door for BLM to euthanize or shoot horses. That same year, we had Congressman Chris Stewart introduce the Interior Appropriations Bill amendment that would have allowed BLM to euthanize healthy unadopted wild horses and burros in government holding facilities, and that passed the House Appropriations Committee on a voice vote. Chris, I don't know if you want to address a little bit of what 2017 was like to try to give people some context for kind of how difficult that was.
It was. I think a lot of people getting an understanding. Yeah, Congress has been building. We've seen over many years, and I'm sorry, I probably sound a little stuffy-headed. I've had kind of the accumulation over the last couple of days. The cold's been building. I ramble on. I've unfortunately probably taking more NyQuil than I should have kind of coming up to this point. So if I kind of ramble off, I apologize for that. We've been building, and Congress has been building, and the BLM has been building to a point where we've had a lot of pressure kind of coming to Congress, and they've coming to a point, certainly with the wild horse issue and Congressman Stewart, as we've seen, kind of getting to a pressure point, building with this language. And we've seen Congress already had language, Senator Burns some years ago, and as you know, called the Burns Rider, that he managed to slip in very late at night, allowing and basically requiring. I think a lot of people forget that. It's requiring the BLM to sell these horses without limitation. And since that time, we've been able to put in language basically limiting that and preventing the BLM from selling these horses. There's been this pressure put on, and Chris Stewart was kind of trying to remove that and giving the BLM, as they were calling it, giving them all the tools in the toolbox to manage these wild horses. And that's where you see with this accumulation a couple of years ago, they wanted all of the tools to manage them, and that was basically allowing them to go out and kill them. There's really no nice way around it. That would have basically amounted to shooting them on the range. There was no other way to deal with it. You could have rounded some off, sent them to slaughter, but basically it would have been shooting them on the range. And we were not able to stop it in the House of Representatives. So that's what this Stewart Amendment would have amounted to back at that time.
And then in conference committee, the Senate stood by that language and kept that language in there that would prevent the Bureau of Land Management from using tax dollars to kill healthy, unadopted wild horses or burros. So for the fiscal year 2019 budget proposal, you see the president's budget proposal has basically the same things again. There's sales without limitation, which is essentially sales to slaughter, and then but also remove language restricting BLM's ability to use all the management tools authorized in the act. Again, that's code for being able to euthanize healthy, unadopted wild horses and burros that are in holding facilities.
What changed really last year was, Chris will talk about this a little more, is that they moved away, having failed at euthanizing wild horses and burros, and moved on to a push for permanent sterilization. And you can see there on the list that kind of took different forms. Secretary Zinke actually used the word spading when talking in front of Congress. The BLM produced a report to Congress that was sort of long overdue that included all sorts of red flags for us, including euthanizing captive horses, those unrestricted sales, permanent sterilization surgery, foreign sales. And then Congressman Stewart was back again, and this time offered an amendment that again passed on a voice vote that would have allowed the Secretary of the Interior himself to decide which herds could reproduce, which ones couldn't, and sort of featured sterilization as a key component of that. And Chris, you want to talk a little bit about the sterilization push?
Yeah, and I think what's important about this is why we included this, to show you the role of activism and the role of the groups that have been in Washington fighting this, and why it's so important to keep this up, is that had everybody not been fighting for this, we would have seen that first proposal put by Mr. Stewart. You would have seen them killed, because he finally had achieved something that Congress had never supported before, the thought of killing horses, because that actually had been put forward many years before, and it didn't get very far, and it kind of crashed and burned because, the outrage of killing horses was something kind of shocking. And it was still shocking even when he put it forward. So, but it had actually taken hold with him and actually had moved through the House of Representatives. But we wanted to include it this time because of the outrage, it didn't move. And so he had to kind of soften the approach. And I still say soften because these things are horrible. The idea of sterilizing the horses, the idea of, doing kind of these, non-reproducing herds and all of these other things are still very unacceptable to return to freedom and many out there. So these are still, very unacceptable, but not as extreme as the year before. And so keeping that constant pressure on and, continuing to push forward with, all of the very viable, humane, sensible alternatives that return to freedom and many others have been presenting, because there are humane alternatives. There are sensible, reasonable plans that are out there. I think as long as we keep presenting those to Congress and showing that there are viable alternatives.
Yeah, so again, the Senate has included some protective language again. The shutdown began before Congress passed the final interior bill, and now the House has passed the Senate's version, which has included the wild horse protections. But because of the shutdown, we're in kind of a limbo. Chris, I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit and kind of where we are and what that means.
We are, as Cory said, we're in various versions, as you've seen. The House, the Senate did pass all of these versions before the end of last Congress. The new House took over. It's under, obviously, Democratic control right now. They then passed all of the bills the Senate passed before the end of the last Congress ended, and they sent them back to the Senate. Now the Senate is refusing to pass them, primarily because they realize the president has said he will not sign them. Again, it's an issue of the wall, and I won't get into that political debate. However, the language to protect the wild horses is in that interior appropriations bill that's floating around. Our language to protect, to continue to defund horse slaughter, which we'll get into later, is floating around in those agriculture appropriations bills that we'll get into. So if and when they actually do vote on something at a later point, unless something dramatic changes, our protections for the horses are in there. So again, unless something dramatic changes. But again, and we'll get into it later on, making calls and all that kind of stuff when we talk about what you can do, which will come up later in the presentation.
So another issue, in addition to the push to euthanizing horses and sterilizing horses, something else that BLM is able to do directly under the law is control sale policy. And so in May of this last year, BLM sent out directions to its field offices changing the sale limits from one buyer being able to purchase 4 horses or burros every 6 months to 24 per day with no waiting period. It didn't reveal that it had made that change until July when it quietly posted it on the website. We've had members of Congress who've been questioning that change and have received little to no response from BLM. Because of the shutdown, it's been difficult to get any facts in terms of how many horses are being sold, so we don't really know what the consequences of that change have been. At the same time, in October, the Forest Service was getting ready to do a roundup at Devil's Garden Wild Horse Territory in Northern California. And the Forest Service announced basically as the roundup was beginning that horses 10 and older that were captured were going to be put up for unrestricted sale at the end of the roundup. That's a situation where the Forest Service is attempting to sort of take advantage of what they see as a loophole that Congress didn't specifically tell them that they couldn't sell horses unrestricted because BLM handles most of it. So RTF and other advocates have filed lawsuits that are still pending regarding that. But these changes to sale policy, even as everybody was sort of paying attention to that permanent sterilization threat, this is something that's ongoing, really of great concern that we have to keep an eye on. So Chris, do you want to say anything else about that?
No, I think this, and we'll approach this again later kind of with oversight. This is just one of those things that we're going to have to, add the new change in Congress and kind of some of the authorizing committee, and I'll explain authorizing committee, with the new chairmanship and the makeup of certainly the House of Representatives, of some chance to have hearings and having members of Congress, who will have some kind of chance to call the BLM in and add this to the list of issues that they want to address with the agency on why they do things and why they've done and why they haven't done various things, specifically regarding to the wild horse and burro program. So this will certainly be one of those issues that we'll add to that list.
So elections, as they say, have consequences. In this case, the Democrats had a net gain of 40 seats in the House, so they take back the majority. Chris will talk to you a little bit about what that means. And the Republican Party expanded slightly its majority in the Senate. Chris, you want to talk a little bit about the results and what those mean?
Yeah, and I think certainly it's an understanding to say, and there is a dynamics to this, because as we've gone through this, you'll hear me say in kind of previous comments and certainly leading forward, is that what has saved the wild horses kind of through the appropriations process, especially, and the horse slaughter defund, have been the Republicans in the Senate. They have been the ones that have stood strong to ensure that wild horse protections and the horse slaughter defund have been maintained. It has been the Republicans in the Senate, while it has been the Republicans in the House who have been the ones, have been undermining those protections in the House of Representatives. However, now with the change in the House of Representatives, we're going to see that flip. We're, hopefully now see with the incoming chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee is Congressman Raul Grijalva, who has long been a very staunch advocate of wild horses. And you can see that on the chart. He is, as a congressman for many years, has been a very big advocate for wild horses. And so we're, hopeful to see, hearings and more letters and calling to task. I mean, if you watched any of the news, he was already calling former Secretary of Interior Zinke to task for many of the things he did. And he will continue to hold former Secretary Zinke to task for things that he did, and he still has the authority to do that. And so we know he'll do that for wild horses as well moving forward. However, we also have Senator Lisa Murkowski. She has been a very good ally in leadership on wild horses and horse slaughter. And for her, she is also the ranking for the chairwoman on Appropriations Subcommittee in the Senate. So she has been a good ally in helping protect wild horses and advocating for horse slaughter in the Senate. That is that mix that we always have to make sure to maintain bipartisanship and be respectful of those parties and the dynamics that we have with those issues moving forward. But that chart in front of you is dealing with the authorizing side of things, which, for the last 10 years for wild horses, we really haven't had a chance to look at kind of the authorizing for actually making changes to the existing Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act, where we have many years ago we did attempt to make changes to the Wild Horse Act, and we did pass a law out of the House to try to make some changes and improvements to the act. It didn't pass in the Senate back then. But we did do some stuff to the House, and maybe, again, I don't know. It's early to tell at this point, but maybe we can try to make some changes to improve the act and address some things. But it is a dynamic that we're going to have to deal with because we have Democrats in charge of the House and Republicans in charge of the Senate. So, as Mr. Grijalva said, he's not a king. He can't dictate over both chambers. He is only the chairman of one committee in one chamber. But it is hopeful that we do have a future to look forward to in that committee.
We don't have a final committee roster when it comes to Republicans, but maybe you can talk about these Democrats.
Yeah, and this kind of pivots on into what I was referencing earlier. We do have the House Appropriations Committee. Again, maybe we'll know more this week from the Republicans. We don't know at this point. The new chairwoman is Heyde York. She's always been fantastic on certainly animal protection issues as a whole. And you can see the rest of the members. These are the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee. So they will be taking over. This is dealing specifically with wild horse and burro issues and many other wildlife issues. I mean, I obviously don't want to leave those out. They'll be dealing with endangered species issues and public lands issues and other issues that can not necessarily deal directly with wild horse issues, but certainly impact wild horse issues directly and indirectly. So, we will see a committee that will be, more receptive and more open to wild horse and burro issues moving forward as well on those. Here is the Senate listing. And we know that most of these are going to be similar to what we had last Congress as well. Very much the same thing. And again, this is going to be a committee that had been already receptive. They had maintained and as we know, in the past, had protected and maintained the wild horse protections. At least as far as we know, they protected them last Congress, and from what we know so far this year, had maintained the wild horse and burro protections. So any outreach we continue to do to them, we will certainly encourage them to maintain any of the wild horse and burro protections and to ensure that we maintain them moving forward with them. We know Senator Udall, Senator Feinstein, all of the Democrats have been very protective, and we wish to encourage Senator Murkowski to maintain her leadership and do everything she can to protect the wild horses and burros moving forward. So any communications, always, again, maintain a positive message to her and anything we do moving forward.
So, Chris, folks always want to know what they can do, and this is kind of early days with this Congress, but then at the same time, we have some leftover business in terms of finalizing that fiscal year 19 language, not finalizing the language, but making sure that those bills are finalized. So it's kind of a weird space to be in, to be telling people, suggesting what to do, but this is what we came up with.
Yeah, I think it's still the same thing because, we should have finished fiscal year 2019 before we even got to this point. But Ms. McCollum is the new chairwoman of that Interior Appropriations Subcommittee, and so now it kind of falls to her. And anything, now the assumption is she will simply continue to try to just basically push forward what has already been agreed to and resolved. And that's what we've seen so far. They have simply picked up the language and they've passed again the language that has already been done. So any communications with her is just continue to encourage her and members of that committee. As you see, you're already going to give people copies of this slide, and everybody can find it on the website. But encourage any of that messaging to her, or if anybody has, if their representatives or members of the subcommittee, to encourage them to support any of these things, any of this bill that's moving forward. And as they then prepare for fiscal year 20, the same thing. We want them to make sure to maintain those protections and all of the things that we continue to put on these lists. And, as we get an idea of what they're preparing to put in fiscal year 20, get an idea of what our messaging will be for fiscal year 20, because that is starting right now. And it will start in February and March and April when they start holding hearings, and Interior comes in and starts giving their presentations and hearings before the subcommittee, and we start getting an idea of what the bill will take shape. We'll get an idea, and we'll be able to kind of tune our alerts, and we'll turn our action alerts to members, and those messages will adjust for everybody, and be able to fine-tune those things moving forward. But this is kind of the basic message that everybody should be reaching out to Representative Chairwoman McCollum and other members of the subcommittee.
And you see in there, Chris talks about fine-tuning the message that, for example, adding the Forest Service is something that, that we're doing in response to what the Forest Service's actions regarding Devil's Garden and those horses. Or, you see that we're really trying to raise the profile of this change that the BLM made in the sale policy. So some of the things are the same, and there are little tweaks in wording along the way that we make sort of in response to things that are happening all the time. And so if you keep track of us on Facebook, in addition to the action alerts that we send out, there are little tweaks in wording that happen along the way, and they happen for a reason, and that's because we have the good fortune of having Chris on the ground up there every day.
Yeah, and the Forest Service, ironically, that actually they started doing that about the time that the original Interior Appropriations bill was supposed to have been finished last year. So it was too close to actually have gotten any changes to the original Interior Appropriations bill. Obviously, now we are well into the new year, and it's still too late because the bill has been wrapped up, but it's still good to do messaging. And we want Congress and we want your appropriators to know that what's happening with the Forest Service and the fact that they're kind of skirting around the language and the intent of Congress. The Congress does not want horses slaughtered. They do not want wild horses slaughtered. So it's good to kind of continue to put that message out and what Forest Service is doing. So if it just kind of continues to burn that message and burns that issue into offices and into legislators' minds. So it's good they hear more and more of it as activists call offices. So it doesn't hurt to put that out there as much as often as possible.
We will take any questions that you have at the moment now.
First question is, what about asking for AMLs to be adjusted based on science and for them to be given back land that was set aside for them? Obviously, for me, for 20 years, we've been screaming that AML is not based on science. I don't think anybody would say they are. The National Academy of Sciences has questioned it. We've questioned it. Everybody's questioned it. Unfortunately, and that's the problem with it, is the law gives a phenomenal amount of discretion to the BLM to set that. And that's the problem. And I think a lot of people forget the fact that the BLM has that discretion to set AML. I know we scream about it, but the BLM has the discretion to set AML. And if we could get back and open the law and change it, that may be the way to do it. Unfortunately, we have not had a Congress where it has been open to changing AML. Because there is the risk if you open the law to change AML, we could make it a lot worse. Because when you open it, we could get run over, and they could make AML very much worse. And they could define it down and make it worse. So that's kind of the risk of doing it that way. As for your second question as well, that is also the other point. I know that has been a big issue because we know, that's...
Chris, can you repeat that question? Chris, can you repeat it just in case people are on the phone?
Oh, the second question. And regarding giving them back land that was set aside for them. yes, I mean, we know they've lost millions and millions of acres of land. The BLM's primary excuse for that is that a lot of it was checkerboarded. Now, some of it is checkerboarded, some of it was given, traded between private ownership and given back, but that's only a very small portion for it. That's been the push, is to give some of it back. But, again, it's been the fight with the BLM to do it. That requires some lawsuits, that requires Congress to get involved, and that has been an ongoing fight. That has been something that is an issue, to try to get them to restore some of the land that has been restored. If not all, at least give them a percentage of the land that has been restored. But that has been something, that I know Return to Freedom, the organization that I was with before, and certainly all of the organizations that fight about, always do talk about, is, why not give them some of the land that has been taken away from them?
In response to the second question that we had there from Tammy about who feeds the horses during the shutdown, there's BLM staff that does that. There are a good many horses that are on private land that's leased by the government, and those contractors are continuing to feed the horses. I saw a story just the other day. They are not getting paid, the contractors that are doing that. Most of them, they're continuing to feed the horses. Some of them have said, we can't do this forever. So that's something of a concern, but at this point, the horses are being fed and taken care of. Do you want to take that next question, Chris?
Yeah, and I did see an article that BLM was making arrangements to make sure that they are paid, even during the shutdown. So, again, how long that will happen, but I did see some agreement, because that's part of their BLM's emergency shutdown policy, to make sure the horses are cared for. So, but that is something we certainly will talk to Congress to make sure that those horses will continue to get cared for. And Laurel had a question: is there any way to bring public awareness to the free-range cattle industry causing this issue? Some way to make the public aware of Mustang-free beef, to bring pressure to bear on the industry. I mean, obviously, that's always been a main concern, is the cattle industry. You hear anywhere between 8 million livestock. And again, that can be sheep and cattle, if not higher numbers than that, competing against a very small number of horses on a smaller percentage of land out there, yet the horses are blamed for everything. It's unfortunate that the cattle industry is also making the profit at taxpayer expense. So you've got those members of Congress who are getting campaign donations from the cattlemen and the cattle industry. They're not getting donations from the wild horses. So they're very protective of the cattle industry. They're not making, there's also other special interest. Oil, green energy now, is also a big exploiter of public lands out west. So there's a lot of special interests that are exploiting and putting pressure on the wild horses out west. It's unfortunate that wild horses are getting hit from all directions on public lands.
In terms of Mustang-free beef, I think one thing that would be challenging about that is that only about 3%, I believe, if maybe even less than that, of the nation's beef comes from public lands. So, almost all of the beef would be Mustang-free. Claire has a really good question. Do you want to take that one, Chris? I'm just passing them all off to you.
I see guest. Is that the last one? What tools does Congress have to demand BLM not allow unrestricted sales of horses, to change the BLM 2018 management policies? Well, Congress actually controls everything. I mean, they can go in and dictate what the BLM does, and that's really what we need. I think that's the only, as I often say to people, is that don't ever expect BLM to do the right thing. They are an agency. They're not going to do the right thing on their own. They're not designed to do the right thing. I always have to remind people that the day before the Wild Horse Act was created, they were the agency that was killing the wild horses. So they're not designed to do what's right. In order to get the BLM to do the right thing, it's going to have to be Congress. So that's why we're having to get the no-kill language in, or anything that we're doing is we have to do it through Congress. So any changes to make sure the BLM does what's right, we're having to do it through Congress. So that's why all of our focus is on getting Congress to step up and force the BLM to do the right thing. So that's why our focus is on that, and that's why BLM, that's why Return to Freedom has, got me focused, and that's why my whole career has been focused on getting Congress to do, to BLM to do what they're doing.
To Claire's question, Chris, if you're a member of Congress, what can you do other than, so if you're Chair Grijalva, you can hold a hearing and talk about the sales policy, but what other options do they have in terms of, is it something like defund language, essentially, that they can make funding contingent on changing that sale language? Where can they go outside of, unless they change the sale policy law altogether? Is there
again, it does kind of go back to Mr. Grijalva's, authority again is limited. He is one of two chairmen that really can do it. So I mean, he can certainly pass legislation. He can move legislation through his committee. He has to get the whole House of Representatives to pass it. It has to go to the Senate. The Senate committee has to pass it. The Senate has to pass it. The President has to sign it. So that's, if we want to make change to get them to do it, certainly that we can then work with the appropriators, and the appropriators can do something which tends to be a little bit faster. We can do things like that to try to make changes through things, and that's often what we've been doing. And unfortunately, because Congress has been so unable or incapable of doing bigger legislative pushes, for many years, not just this Congress, but for many Congresses now, they've been doing things through the appropriations process. That may be ultimately what we do. Mr. Grijalva can certainly do hearings to expose things, which will help us move things through the appropriations process. So that may be the ultimate thing, what he can do, to expose things through hearings and committees. And he can move legislation, which will help us facilitate kind of a bigger picture, ultimately.
So there's a question here about Todd Gloria. Todd Gloria is a member of the California legislature. He is planning to, and so the question is, what became of Todd Gloria's bill? He is planning to introduce state legislation to try to improve protection of wild horses. At this point, he's only entered sort of the shell of a bill, just signaling his intent, but he hasn't there's not language yet. But that will be a California-only sort of thing. California already has pretty good state laws. I guess, Chris, I don't know if there's anybody better when it comes to, banning slaughter, transportation out of the state for slaughter, those sorts of things. So I don't know exactly what he'll come up with, but that's still a work in progress. We wanted to move along to the horse slaughter issue. Looking back very quickly at the last Congress with the horse slaughter issue, first I think it's important to talk about, when it comes to horse slaughter, we kind of work on this in a couple ways, and that's, one is sort of the continuing a temporary ban year after year after year, and one is the longer term solution. So I wanted to maybe have Chris talk a little about what the defund amendment is and that we work on every year.
Yeah, we've had, and I won't go into the history because my history goes, of course, slaughter back to 2001, and I don't think a lot of people realize that we actually introduced the first horse slaughter bill to ban horse slaughter in 2002, and there have been numerous versions of that up to where we are now, the Safeguard American Food Exports Act, and that's where we are currently. And that bill will ban the slaughter of horses, based on a food safety issue, and that will ban the export and end it permanently. And I won't get into that aspect of it because we're here to, we're talking about the defund at this point. But as we've been trying to work on ending it permanently with the SAFE Act, we have also been working kind of in tandem with that on an amendment annually through the annual appropriations process, because again, that's really, as I alluded to earlier, kind of the only thing that Congress has been doing. They've been kind of only funding the government. And I say that kind of, as I just got done saying we can't even fund the government right now, but that's been what they've been doing is, passing appropriations bills. So what we've done is work on an amendment to defund or slaughter inspections. And what we did that is because by law, all meat for human consumption is required by law to be inspected by USDA inspectors. So if you remove inspections for slaughter facilities, that meat can no longer be used for human consumption. So you're basically removing it, making it no longer usable for human consumption, therefore closing the plants down. So we've been keeping the horse slaughter plants closed, and they all closed down. We closed the last one in Illinois under state law. I worked on that state bill and closed it down. And we closed the other two in Texas in 2007, the same year, under a 1949 law. And I worked with the Texas attorney down there. I was just talking to him. I'm like, that law really looks like it should close the plants down. And he was able to work with, the Texas attorney general at the time, got the law, and realized it was. They worked with the local county attorneys and got the laws closed, and those two plants closed as well. And then since that time, except for 1 year, we've been defunding the horse slaughter plants through the USDA to keep the inspectors out of the plants. So that's what the defund amendment does. It's not the answer. It's not what we want to do. It takes a phenomenal amount of our effort and time every year to fight on this because it's not something that's easy. It's not something that simply flies through. It takes a phenomenal amount of our time and effort every year to get through the appropriations process, and it does distract our efforts away from working on the larger SAFE Act.
As you can see here, in just looking back a little bit, in 2017, the House Appropriations Committee actually rejected the defund amendment, and then in 2018, the House Appropriations Committee did not include the defund amendment again. And unfortunately, in both cases, as it was with the wild horses, the senators have stepped up again and included the defund amendment in the fiscal year 18 and fiscal year 19 budgets. Moving on to the SAFE Act, which Chris was talking about, that would ban horse slaughter permanently in the U.S., as well as the closing the border so that more than 100,000 horses to go to Mexico, Canada, and beyond every year. So to some level, there was success. You can see the number of co-sponsors there, 218 in the House and 30 in the Senate. But we have to start over from scratch. And Chris, maybe you can talk a bit about why those bills died in committee.
Yeah, it's it's difficult. It's again, as I kind of alluded to earlier, is that standalone bills in the last few Congresses are kind of when I say standalone bills that are authorized and they pass individually. We really haven't seen a lot of them other than kind of big messaging bills, big standalone bills on immigration and other kind of big party line bills really have not been moving. And so this way, the horse slaughter bills have kind of been caught up with that and gotten caught. We have a lot of co-sponsors, but co-sponsors don't always mean. I know we see alerts that go out and, hey, 218, that's great. 218 in the House is the number that's needed to pass any bill. That's 218, that's the majority, that's great. But that doesn't necessarily mean it will pass. And so I think we often get hung up on that number. Unfortunately, there's a bill called the PAST Act, which is the bill to ban horse soaring. That had, not exactly, I think it ran around 290 votes or 290 co-sponsors, which obviously is many more than 218, and it didn't move anywhere either. So, while 218 is great, we need to, certainly think about we need the speaker. who controls what bills make it to the floor, and we need the Senate Majority Leader, which is who controls what bills make it to the floor. We need them to kind of shake things loose, and we need to convince them to move these bills to the floor, not just the number of co-sponsors. Co-sponsors are very important, and we don't want to downplay those. And it's very important to call your legislator. We need everybody to co-sponsor these things. We need as many co-sponsors as possible. We need far more than 218. We need far more than 30 in the Senate on all these bills, and to move those things forward. In the House, unfortunately, that bill, the SAFE Act, is always kind of gets stuck in two committees. The Agriculture Committee manages to get its hands on our bills because it's an agriculture issue to an extent. So they always manage to grab a hold on it. It's like a death grip because they want to get a hold of it and kill it. But again, as we get our numbers up, we can get the Speaker committed to saying, we're not going to let you just kill it. We're going to move it because we know the public is behind it. We know the leadership's behind it. We want to move this thing. So that's what we need. That's what we need the public behind these things to shake these bills loose. I've been doing this for 18 years. I'll give you a second to let that sink in. 18 years. That's not something to brag about. I was sitting in a small room in upstate New York talking about this, and everybody's like, woo-hoo, cheering, and I'm like, that's not something to brag about. This is something we need to end. This is ridiculous that this thing has been around. It's always been widely popular. We've got the votes to pass. If we can get to the floor, we need to end it. So that's what we need to think about. I would take 6 co-sponsors and the Speaker's commitment to move it to the floor to pass it. That's what we need. So that's got to be our focus to get it. If any of you know Speaker Pelosi, please give me a call. I'll give you my cell phone number. If any of you know her directly, that's what I want to know. Don't hold that back on me. Please call me and let me know. But follow Return to Freedom. We'll know soon when the SAFE Act is ready to be reintroduced. So be sure to follow Return to Freedom. And when we have news on the SAFE Act's reintroduction, we'll have that up online as soon as possible.
And Chris, we were talking earlier, this is, again, back to the sort of elections have consequences thing. There's some positives and negatives when you look through the lens of the horse slaughter issue at the changes in the House, because you have Democrats that historically might have been good on this issue, but you lost a lot of moderate Republicans that were co-sponsors on the way. So that 218 sounds like great we're there, but obviously it's not that easy.
Yeah, well, I think there's an assumption when we talk about 218, you have to remember all of those had died. A couple of them had been convicted of crimes and had retired. Several of them had already retired on their own. Our number had dropped below that. And now with the new Congress, we had a lot that are gone. Some of those were, moderate Republicans that are gone. So, we're going to start at a much lower number than the 218 when they come back. So, again, our number will be high on co-sponsorship. But I always assume we're going to start at almost zero, the sponsors who are going to be the same sponsors as we've had before. And I think that's one of the questions. So hopefully I answered that for you. It'll be the same leadership team, and we'll drop that and, start hitting the ground running. And many of the originals, a lot of them will come right back on. Not everybody. That's the frustrating thing. A lot of them we're going to have to go back to many of them who have been on and convince them to come back on again. Many of them will. And ultimately all of them will. And then we'll have to hit all of the brand new members to come back on as well. All of the senators, the 30, minus the originals, Senator Graham and Menendez, all returned. So we'll have to meet with all of them and let them know the bill's been reintroduced and get them to come back on again.
Chris, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about, we have the committee lineup here.
Yeah, this is the House Agriculture Appropriations Subcommittee. And again, this could be this will be a different change for us because obviously, and again, I alluded to it earlier, is that under the Republican control, they were very negative to the horse slaughter defund language, and very negative, very aggressively opposed to including it, supporting it. There was open opposition to it, spoke against it. that should change or will change, hopefully. I mean, I don't see why it wouldn't. Mr. Bishop spoke in favor of it. Not this Congress, because again, it kind of, it didn't get offered. But the previous, he spoke in favor of it, has been supportive. Hopefully he should be supportive of it. Mr. Lauro has been a long-standing champion of it. All the other members have been supportive of it. So, hopefully this Congress moving forward, the House will be supportive of the language. Their counterparts in the Senate last year, for the first time in all the years we've been doing it, actually included it in what's called the Manager's Amendment. And the Manager's Amendment is a package of amendments and changes that the majority and the minority agree to together before, when they bring the bill up in committee. It's kind of changes that both majority and the minority agree to as they're heading in to consider the bill in committee. So they just kind of, say, hey, this is the Manager's Amendment. Both sides agree to it. No objections. The amendments agreed to onto the bill. And thankfully, I give the chairman Owen a credit. Our language was included in that for the first time since we've been doing this. So hopefully that'll happen again this year. We can't be sure, but if we're polite and grateful for his support last year, and hopefully that'll happen again this year moving forward. And we'll see, when they get to that point of considering amendments, that ours is included again this year. So we'll hopefully have another positive year on horsewater defund moving forward for fiscal year 2020.
And this committee is largely the same in the Senate?
Yes.
Okay, in terms of what folks can do at the moment, this is kind of a little more forward-looking. It's kind of looking both at the House and Senate and getting folks, until we have a SAFE Act bill to tell you that to run with and go to your senators and your congressmen to support. In the meantime, something you can do is to support that defund amendment. And there's the Agricultural Appropriations Subcommittee in both the House and the Senate. You can write them, and you can find the contact information. Again, we'll have those lists, and hopefully we'll have the Republicans. We can add those to the slides when we send those out to you. But you can find the contact information on the website, those members of Congress and the Senate. A quick commercial before we get to our final set of questions. The Wild Horse Defense Fund for RTF is what it fuels Chris's work as a lobbyist, our grassroots advocacy efforts, all the things that I do on social media and the action alerts you receive, as well as on-range monitoring of helicopter roundups, and also the legal work that we do. We have a couple of important court cases going. I mentioned the Devil's Garden court case. There's also a court case in Utah right now where Beaver County is trying to force the BLM to round up all of the horses immediately that are considered excess horses, rather than the BLM being allowed to use fertility control. So that's another case, and both of those we're working with coalitions of advocates, and the Wild Horse Defense Fund makes that possible. So we have some questions here. One from our dear friend Elaine Nash from Fleet of Angels, who we worked with on the Gila herd rescue, and her folks have done some great things. Again, you've seen the wildfires in Northern California, helping horse owners up there. But Chris, you have the question that maybe, this is a tough one, about how compliance would be enforced if the SAFE Act is passed.
Certainly, well, domestically, compliance would be no horses would be allowed to be slaughtered in the United States because they wouldn't be going into a slaughter facility. So, there wouldn't be any slaughter facilities allowed for horses because they would all be deemed unsafe for human consumption, blanketly. So that, if a horse showed up at a slaughter facility for human consumption, they would not be allowed because it would be a blanket consumption or a blanket ban on them. Going out of the United States, you'd basically have to lie going out of the United States. So if it's a horse coming out of the U.S., you'd have to rely on the documentation going out, and then that would be just the risk of, going to another facility outside of the United States because they would be deemed unsafe going out of the United States. It would be a risk, and whoever would accept them into a foreign country, because you'd have, whatever documentation would be going outside of the United States. So it'd be just a risk of whatever plant would be taking them because they'd be deemed unsafe leaving the U.S. You could take them for show or riding or whatever documentation would be saying it's unsafe for human consumption leaving the United States. And then whatever plant would be taking them in would be willing to risk going around the documentation. Now, that doesn't mean these are all high standard quality places, but again, there's a misperception that, a lot of the places, at least that would be sending the meat second party going back to the EU or going elsewhere would be EU-approved facilities would want to have some kind of oversight. So they would want to have proper paperwork. And if they're having paperwork saying they just processed 8 works from the United States saying that meat is unsafe, they then run the risk of processing an unsafe horse coming from the United States.
First, I think we have a question here from Jamie.
I was wondering how we are allowing horses to leave out of the United States now for slaughter, since it's illegal in the U.S. And you guys kind of answered that question.
How are they being exported out of the United States? Well, that's the problem. I think you've hit the problem, and why the education is so critical in this. We've only defunded horse slaughter facilities in the United States, and that is kind of the problem. Is why we need the SAFE Act so desperately. Again, that's been my goal from day one. I mean, that's been my goal from 2001 when I first picked up this issue. Is that we need an authorizing full-time ban. The defund language is not our solution. It's not what I wanted to do. It's not what I want to do at all. We need the SAFE Act. We need the permanent ban, because without it, that's all of these killer buyers have continued to simply shove horses across the borders, north and south. And that's what we've seen, is they've continued to simply shove the problem across. Because the defunding only stops the horse slaughter plants from opening here. And it does nothing to prohibit them from being exported out of the United States. That's why we need the SAFE Act.
Tammy has a question here that might be a good one to end on. It's one that we get all the time. I'm sure Chris gets it all the time, about whether it's better to call or write or email congressmen or senators. And I guess we could also add to that list meeting with your representative, social media stuff. Chris, as somebody who's worked in a couple of Senate offices, how would you sort of rank those in terms of effectiveness?
Yeah, I'll kind of give you a quick rundown. Now, I'll go to date myself on when I started on the Hill. It was a long time ago, pre-email. But I still go back and I still encourage everybody, and I'll again kind of rank these, and then I'll give you a reasoning why and timing. I still encourage everybody. You can't do these all the time, but I would encourage you to at least once a month handwrite a letter. And you can pick on who you do it, but handwrite a letter. It can even be a postcard. But just sit down and do it. And I say that because there was a member of Congress who was our sponsor of this bill, the horse slaughter bill, some years ago. And a lot of members of Congress will still have their staff give them to read the handwritten letters that they get, because they realize those are the people that took the time and the effort to think about the issues that they care about. They want to read the handwritten letters. So if you put the effort to handwrite a note to your member of Congress, they often want to see them. They want to know what you took the time to do. So even if you do it only once a month to somebody randomly, take the time to do it. And make it a personal. Don't just form. I'm not a fan of form emails. I don't like them. I wouldn't do them. I don't do them. I still don't do them from the groups, because that doesn't show you put any effort into doing them. Now, I don't mean to if there's anybody from other groups on this call, I don't mean to scatter everybody going, oh my God, all that effort. I think they're okay, but it doesn't show you put the time into doing it. They do get registered, but take that time to just do a handwritten letter. Next, I would do a call. Again, because you make the call, be very precise. because you're getting a young person who's picking up the phone, he's taking phone calls on the wall, he's taking it on immigration, he's taking it on healthcare, he's taking it on the government shutdown, he's taking it on 1,000 other issues, and he's a young person. But he does listen. I promise you, they do listen. They do care. Be precise. Be short. Be polite with him. Tell him where you're from. If you're not from the district, tell him why you're calling. Some of the appropriations issue. Just say, hey, your boss is on appropriations. This is an impact that it does impact me. You're on a very small, very specific committee. Just want to let you know. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Goodbye. Just do send them an email if you can get through on the email system. Let's just, try all of these options that you can get through with them. But again, start off with doing a handwritten email or a handwritten note card or a letter if you can do it, and spread them out. But those are kind of the order that I would do these kinds of things. And I don't discourage an email or a petition if you can do them. But I would do that last and always try to customize them. If you have the option to add a personal paragraph, and he will allow you to customize and put in a personal story. Add something personal to you. Be polite, be courteous, and be very specific, but be very factual with what you do, because that matters. And, we need to make sure animal activists don't come off. I always vision animal activists or with your hair standing up, you're sitting in your parents' basement. Don't come off as the wild-eyed activist. Be factual, be polite. Because we've got the facts. The facts are on our side. The numbers are on our side. Now's the time to present the truth about this issue, because, now's the time to make the change and the difference.
I will just say that we will have a number of things rolling out in the near future. You'll, in addition to getting a follow-up email about this webinar, keep an eye on our social media. We'll have things coming. We'll have targeted letters. We'll have information on whatever the successor to the SAFE Act is. So keep an eye on those things. Please tell your friends, tell your family, share our posts. We appreciate that. Thanks so much to everyone who turned out tonight, especially the folks on the East Coast where it's cold and late, like Chris. And so I hope everybody has a good night. And thanks so much for joining us.